Yeah, then the TV, of course.
We did learn. I haven't.
Oh, how to do all that, no, good, okay.
But it's funny, I did not see.
No. The first week that I had to do it, it was listed on the T site, and then it wasn't, and so then I've been going through the website.
The website itself.
And I always, I mean, I always open it up.
Yeah, because you know, this morning, or this afternoon, there was.
Well, how are you today?
Good. Good.
For the next one that was listed on there was Rochester on Wednesday.
Yeah.
Where did I-
Somewhere I go this year.
We'll have a lovely class.
Next week,
Good night,
Cantor is
Pauline.
teaching, so I get to go.
We'll see ya.
Yeah.
I don't think she's supposed to get to January.
Yeah. But I will be here.
Thank you.
So this is your. Zoom on But we learned tons of different ways to get on today. We went to make a talk.
Oh. Maybe someone here has, so I don't have to go all the way back to my office. Does anyone here have an extra piece of paper and a pen to give this lady? Take notes. You can also use the back of this. You can also spread the, you can also use the back of this. That I'm gonna
Paper here.
I keep like bumping into you today, like all the time.
I know.
Crazy stuff. Sometimes I don't see you for a month, and then I see you.
So it's like it was planned.
I know, it's predestination. I just this past one. And that's what we down to the next one. I don't see a whole lot of people on Zoom yet. And then someone is doing the attendance, right? This is all so exciting. I get free coffee to compliment with my job. So, so how's this class been doing? Everything's fine? What was the previous class about? Does anyone remember? Like last week? Folklore. Folklore. Yeah, that sounds fun. But you didn't have a class like about Jewish philosophy or something like that. Did you have a class about Mishnah, Talmud, any of the books, like rabbinic? A little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And this is more or less it? This is more or less the form? Okay, good. We'll just, it starts at 7:15 officially, right? Wait a minute. Oh, there's a, like, give it a minute literally. It's like 14. Watch this. Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Good. How about you?
Good. There's been some papers that have been passed to make sure you have a copy. This one of this diagram, and then one of this. Yeah, this. Oh, more and more are coming. You can also, I'm going to pass this pile of books. And they're all like, except for one, they're all the same. They're all the Zohar, but different editions. Some are English, so this is just tells. This is all the book of Zohar. Some Hebrew, some English, some Aramaic. So you can just pass it around to get an impression as I speak. For all the ADHD people who need to have something to do. So, all right, welcome to our class about Kabbalah. I'm so glad to be teaching it to this group that I'm so happy that this group exists in the world, and at Temple Sinai in particular, and that we have this opportunity to study about this topic that also is one of topic that's dear and close to my own heart and actually life story, and both as a person and as a Jewish person and as a rabbi, and also to understanding Judaism as a whole. It's really hard to understand Judaism without understanding Kabbalah, and it's a little bit strange that you didn't have like a class that maybe something to think about for next year about Jewish philosophy, because you want to come to this class, Karen? You're thinking you want to like listen for a few minutes, then I won't get offended if you leave.
I have to talk to David real quick.
Okay, so you can come afterwards. Yeah. All right. So I think it's because Kabbalah is really talking to Jewish philosophy and Jewish history, and so I understand that this is a class that we can't. It's a course that we can't encompass everything yet. So we'll just do our best, and then I'll talk and you'll ask questions, and we'll hopefully everything's going to be fine. So maybe to warm up and start, how many of you raise your hand if you've never heard the word Kabbalah before? You probably will. You never have.
I don't.
Never. That's fine. I'm just interested. Never heard of it before. Okay. Raise your hand if you have heard the word Kabbalah before. Okay. Those of you who have, maybe you can go around the room. Tell me one word that like comes to your mind when you think about Kabbalah. One word.
I mean,
mysticism is the only.
Mysticism, that's great.
Light.
Light.
Madonna,
What's that?
Madonna.
Madonna.
She was into it.
She was into it. I think she still is, as far as I know. That's a word. You can say Madonna as well. She's very popular. You can say Madonna again. Do you have another word?
Ghosts.
Ghosts. Mhm.
Spirituality.
Spirituality.
Wisdom.
Wisdom.
Depth.
Depth. Pass.
Esotericism.
Esotericism. Mhm.
Meditation.
Meditation.
The divine.
The divine. You're gonna pass. Anything?
Just say divine as well.
Divine. Great. I don't think you can just go home. That's all. That's really all I have to say about that. Right. So all of the above that you said, and maybe we'll try to put some order into it. So I've comprised this. Actually, I wrote this little piece. I've kind of like re-edited it towards this class, but the first time I taught this one is when I was actually teaching in London. For a month, I was working in London in a Jewish Reform congregation in London. Actually, in November 2023, it was a very tumultuous time for the Jewish people, actually. A month after October 7th, and I was in London. I was working there for a month as a substitute rabbi. And one of the things that they asked me to do was to teach, there was a Judaism 101 class there, which they call Jewish Essentials. Very similar to this group, only in London. And they asked me to teach a class about Kabbalah, which they never taught before. So I prepared this lecture for that. And then just before coming back to teach you, I just kind of like revisited and changed the wording a little bit, but it's kind of like being interesting to teach it again in America this time. So knowing that we have very little time, I'll try to be systematic. I'll go through it. Maybe you could, after every paragraph, maybe you could ask me questions. And then we could just go forward with it, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So who wants to read the first paragraph? Who's willing? Anyone? Go ahead. The lilac person. Remind me your name?
Ren.
Ren. Mm-hmm.
Jewish mysticism, commonly known as Kabbalah, is a rich and intricate tradition woven through Jewish history, culture, and spirituality. This overview explores its origins, major texts, defining themes, relationships to Judaism, and the mutual influences between Kabbalah and other world religions.
Okay, any questions so far? Anything that comes to mind? This is more like an introductory paragraph, so I don't know if there's much to ask, but any thoughts that come so far? Anyone? Let me just go on to the next one. Next paragraph? Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. Jewish mystical ideas can be traced back to biblical and Second Temple literature, including Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot, the poetic mysticism of the Song of Songs, and earlier and Hallel traditions.
Keep going, the whole thing.
Kabbalah reached a major flowering in the medieval period, especially with the emergence of the Zohar in 13th century Spain and the later development of the Sabbatean school in the 16th century under figures such as Rabbi Isaac Luria and Rabbi Moses
Cordovera.
Their systems articulated profound teachings about God, creation, divine emanation, exile, and repair. As Judaism entered modernity, Kabbalah continued shaping major, often opposing Jewish movements, including Hasidism. Jewish Enlightenment critiques Zionism, secular Jewish culture, and contemporary Jewish New Age or Neo-Hasidic spiritualities.
All right. Any questions so far? It's a very condensed text, I know, but just don't just ask anything that comes to mind or comment.
How did it shape Zionism?
Great question. So the interesting thing about Kabbalah, it actually inspired many different, as the text says, often opposed or seemingly opposed modern phenomena, or because because some of, A, because it's, like it's been said here, A, because it's deep and profound and also very kind of like mind-blowing and creative, that it kind of, people who studied it went in often very different directions. For example, and I'll get to Zionism. For example, one of the interesting things is that some of the people who kind of invented modern orthodoxy were Kabbalists. Did they teach you about Shulchan Aruch yet? Shulchan Aruch is a book written in Sefat, which was came out of Kabbalistic circles. The rabbi who wrote it was Rabbi Yosef Karo. He's buried in Sefat. He lived there in the 16th century. He was part of the Lurianic circle. In other words, the Kabbalists who gathered around Rabbi Isaac Luria, the divine in Sefat. He wrote the Shulchan Aruch, which is basically the Orthodox Codex of law that all Orthodox Jews adhere to until this day. If you ask an Orthodox Jew what they do on Sabbath, how they eat kosher, everything that they do, their source is Shulchan Aruch, and the person who wrote it was a Kabbalistic rabbi. So part of that, so Kabbalah inspired that one to Orthodoxy. Whereas at the same time, because Kabbalah was talking about the spiritual experience of the person as they practice Judaism, rather than just following like the dry law. It also inspired secular Judaism and Reform Judaism, because once you have separated the law from its meaning, one can say, well, who needs the law? We can just keep the meaning. Right? So you can see how Kabbalah can inspire both an Orthodox approach, because some Orthodox people are saying, I want to worship God according to the Jewish commandments, but in a very particular way with very particular spiritual intentions, so they could become very like orthodoxly religious. Whereas as other people would say, well, if the inner intention and the spirituality of the individual are so important when I'm doing all these rituals, what if I don't do these rituals, but only keep the inner intention or change the rituals? So Kabbalah actually inspired secular Jews or Reform Judaism. Right? So you can see how from the same phenomena like Kabbalah, which we don't even know what it is, but you're already asking the question. Now Zionism, because part of Kabbalah has two things. One, the return of Jewish people to the historic land of the Jewish people, often referred to as Zionism, was mainly a modern phenomena. It's usually thought of as in the 19th and 20th century, and until today. However, when the Kabbalists in Tzfat, they go to Tzfat and other places, by the way, including Gaza even. I just learned that, I just watched a documentary about that this weekend. Some of them went back to the land of Israel when it was not the land of Israel, nor was it Palestine. It was part of the Jewish Ottoman Empire. And groups of Jews, it was not a national thing. In fact, nationalism is a modern concept that did not exist in, let's say, the 16th century at all. It was just the Ottoman Empire, and the land of Israel was part of that. And they went back to places like Tzfat, mainly Tzfat, because they were inspired by the mysticism of the Zohar, which spoke about a group of Jewish Kabbalist mystics, spiritual seekers who are wandering about the mountaintops of the Galilee, etc. And they wanted to actually live that. So they went there they were a very small group. There were a few hundred people. They weren't thinking about a Jewish state or statehood. But that idea that I want to live the thing and be the thing. And therefore I'm going to go to the holy land of the Jewish people. And they never dreamed that there will ever be independence and all. They were all Ottoman subjects. Right, the Rabbi Moses Cordovero that I mentioned here, he came from Cordova, Spain. That's why he was called Cordovero. He went from Cordova to Tzfat, which is in the Galilee, Israel. So that in that sense, they much before modern day Zionism, there were Jewish people who moved to the land of Israel to kind of like fulfill a certain lifestyle that they wanted to do in the Holy Land because they thought it was holy. And needless to say, when and then that also in reality, so when the big waves of Jewish immigration to Israel happened as part of the big waves of Zionism, there are already Jews there because of those Kabbalists. And also needless to say that that kind of like ethos of, the Zionism didn't come out of nowhere, in other words. They already had a few centuries of that. But there were other Kabbalists who didn't care anything about the state of Israel or the land of Israel, and they kind of saw the Jewish spirituality and the actualization of that in more universal terms, and they went to 1,000 other places that were not the land of Israel. So there's really, we actually see, there's actually streams of Kabbalah who speak of like a more universal spiritual path, or not even just to the Jews, or that you can be a Jew anywhere, and that the promised land is actually not a physical place, it's more like a state of mind. Right, so again, it also influenced Zionism, but Zionism is not the only thing that it influenced. It's actually much broader than that. Right, so you could be a Zionist or an a-Zionist and still be influenced from Kabbalah. It actually transcends that. But it's interesting to notice that a lot of the modern phenomena that we see in Judaism today, whether in Israel or in the United States or in Europe and a lot of other places, is influenced by Kabbalah. All right, other questions about this paragraph? Because you took us right to the contra, but it's my fault. I put it in the text, so but yes. And it's actually hard to understand modern phenomena such as Zionism, but also other like contemporary Jewish spirituality and even the Reform Judaism in which we're without understanding the Kabbalistic influences that are heavy and deep, more than people realize. Yeah.
Something I think is interesting, that I guess the one thing I knew about Kabbalah is how much Hasidism is inspired by the Kabbalah. And I think before learning more about it, I thought that Orthodox was like this very legalistic kind of thing. And then reading more about it, finding out it's a lot more mystical and ecstatic, even though it's within this rigid. Can you talk about ways that the mysticalness inspired the Kabbalah of the Baal Shem Tov?
The mystical Kabbalah inspired? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, so this is more like maybe, and we're kind of talking about the influences of Kabbalah in later stages without talking about the thing itself, but to say that maybe I'll backtrace and I'll say that when do we start? So what is mysticism? What is spirituality? And what is Kabbalah? And how is that different than, let's say, a prophet in the Bible? Is it who talks to God? Is that not mysticism and Kabbalah, right? So let's just say that the spiritual element in Judaism has always been there. Judaism is a religion, and when it started with prophets and revelation, and people who had visions and people who spoke to the divine, and angels that came down, and that was there from the very beginning. If you look at the Bible, almost in every page, there are people talking to God. And God is present, and actually nobody is surprised that God is like, oh, hi, coming for lunch, hello, And if you look in the 5 books of Moses, it's pretty clear that God is actually not all that abstract, and that God has an image, right? And God has wrath, and God has, you can't see God's front, but you can see God's back. And that's it. That's in the Torah, right? And prophets in the Bible had dreams when they saw things, and and angels appeared to Abraham, etc. And not to mention Moses and all the miracles. In other words, supernatural revelation, the divine visiting people on earth. All that is not something that Kabbalah invented. It's all over the Bible. It's been there from the very get-go. Okay. We can say that in later generations, revelation has maybe become less prominent, or something that people question. It's like as we go into the medieval times and then into modern times, people are saying, wait, but if I come to you and say to you, today I had lunch with 2 imams from the Islamic Center, And, we were talking about revelation and that the Quran was given to the Arabs, to the Muslims by angel Gabriel. And I told them, well, if I came to you tomorrow and said that Archangel Gabriel spoke to me, how will you know that I was lying or not? Right? But these are these are modern thoughts, right? Because in modernity, if somebody comes, if I'll tell Angel Michael or Gabriel came and told me that you have to wear your underwear, on top of your pants, you'd probably like lock me up in some institution, right? You see what I mean? In other words, these are all modern things. In biblical times, revelation, spirituality was very prominent, and then later on, humanity started to ask, but how do we know? And we became more critical, and that's why I think it's fair to say that although Kabbalah has its roots from times of antiquity, probably even before the Bible, because even before there was the Bible and the Torah, there were people, let's say in the land of that we now call Israel, Canaan, whatever it is, who had divine revelations and different gods and pagan gods talking to them. See what I mean? So these things go they're as ancient as time, as the first people who drew things on caves and try to make sense of this reality, right? But Kabbalah isn't described as a distinct kind of like tradition within Judaism that is called Kabbalah until much later. So the root, and I'm going to get to Hasidism, because that's after, but Kabbalah started as, let's say, the roots of it are in the stories that we know from the Torah about God creating the world in 7 days. There even is a God, right? About Abraham and all those folks discovering that there's that one God that's talking to them and there's a moving force, right? Then if you move past the Bible into rabbinic Judaism, Texas, the Mishnah and the Talmud, there's no Kabbalah per se, but there is a lot of stories about sages and things that they had and interaction that they had with the divine and different talks about esoteric knowledge. Someone here was saying esotericism, right? And rabbis who had experiences, some of them, by the way, dangerous, but it's not Kabbalah per se. Later on, as we progress in Jewish history more towards the Middle Ages, medieval times, and especially as all of a sudden Jewish thought and Jewish tradition is met with Greek philosophy, whether directly from the Greeks and the Romans or through the Muslims that amongst which Jews live. And then, Jews are starting to think about the world through philosophic lens. How do we know? We're more critical. How do we know that we know what we know? Then Kabbalah has to kind of like redefine itself as opposed to, or in conversation with all these slightly more philosophical or pre-modern concepts. And then it kind of like has to say, oh, but there's this thing called Kabbalah. And historically speaking, when we speak about Jewish texts that are of the more mystical tradition, and that is also a question, what the heck does that word mystical mean? Because mist just means cloudy, right? But but traditionally known as mystical, they mentioned here the literature of Heichalot and Merkava as Talmudic era pre-Kabbalistic texts. The first book or composition, it's not hardly a book, it's really more like a notebook, that is thought of as the first Kabbalistic book is called the Book of Creation, Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. There's a huge debate as to when it was written. It's attributed to Abraham, no less, but it's actually, to the best of my understanding, was probably written around the year 600. It's pretty ancient, because you can trace early Muslim thought in it, and you can tell, but people have debated that. Then the next composition would be the book Bahir, which means very like bright light. It's about 11th century. And then, like it said here, the flourishing, the big renaissance of Kabbalah as we know it today is from the book of Zohar, like my last name, which means radiance. And that is more or less from the 13th century, like if you need it for your notes, although it's really been written by many people and some parts of it have been traced to at least the 10th century. And the later parts could be 14th century. So it's many people who wrote and added and wrote and added, but more or less 13th century, more or less in Spain, by the way, not in Israel, not in America, in Spain. And that was the big, and once we have the book of Zohar in the 13th century, we can really talk about Kabbalah as a rich living tradition. Then the next step is what I mentioned before is Lurianic Kabbalah around the 16th century in Tzfat. Those people who read the book of Zohar, read about sages, ancient sages who are living in, even though it was written in Spain, they pretended to be ancient rabbis who lived in Israel in the 2nd century. So Isaac Rabbi Luria the Divine was called divine because he came to Tzfat from Egypt, and he was only there. I think he came there at age 32 and died from pneumonia at age 34. But in the 2 years that he was there, all the other Kabbalists who were there accepted him as a very phenomenal teacher. They called him the divine, and he had added a whole other level of Kabbalah in the 16th century. And then there's another episode that nobody ever talks about, which is Shabtai Tzvi, who was the false Messiah, the fallen Messiah. That's in the 17th century. It's also based on Kabbalah. And after that, we're already going to Hasidism, which is really like 18th century phenomena of basically Eastern European rabbis who are taking Kabbalistic ideas that tend to be complicated and esoteric, simplifying them, bringing them to people. And also, 18th century is already like modernity almost, right? So basically adopting it to like pre-modern and modern era kind of thought. Usually the Hasidic model is of a charismatic leader, like a rabbi who's kind of like almost a guru-like, and has like a group of people following him. And then, so that's kind of like what it is. Any more thoughts about this paragraph before we continue reading? Or should we just continue reading? Let's continue reading. Yeah? Who wants to read the next paragraph? We're in Jewish, a good question. Jewish mysticism has had cultural significance. Yeah, go ahead.
Jewish mysticism has had a lasting impact on Jewish creativity and communal life. Its themes appear in literature, poetry, music, and visual art. Kabbalistic motifs animate Jewish liturgy, most famously in Kabbalah Shabbat, which infuses the Sabbath with a mystical language of cosmic harmony. For many seekers across generations, Kabbalah has offered a spiritual vocabulary for meaning, purpose, and intimacy with the divine.
Questions about that?
So our services, Friday night service, typical Friday night service, there are Kabbalah themes, but it's not strictly, I guess I never thought of it this way, as strictly following, I don't even know if this is a thing, following Kabbalah.
Well, so it's a very interesting point that you're making, because in fact, it's very interesting that the main meeting of the Reform in American Reform Judaism is Friday night services. And traditionally, Friday night services were not that. The main, in Orthodox synagogues until today, and in some Reform and Conservative synagogues as well, the main prayer of Saturday was always Saturday morning. On Saturday morning, it's a long prayer. People read from the Torah. There's a haftarah. That's why we do bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs on Saturday mornings. There's more time in the morning. Friday night, basically, when I grew up in Orthodox synagogue in Israel, Shabbat evening services are rather short because you just want to pray and then go eat your dinner. Like, why do we have to stay in synagogue? And, it's like, doesn't make sense, right? So, however, in Reform Judaism, because for practical reasons, I guess people wanted to sleep in on Saturday morning. I don't know. It became that Friday night is the main event of the week, and that entire service is a Kabbalistic invention that just did not exist before Lurianic Kabbalah in the 16th century. They're the ones who invented it as we know it today. Now, to be exact, there was always a Friday night prayer because traditionally Jewish people pray, how many times a day? Three times a day. One of them would be the evening prayer. But the evening prayer traditionally is extremely short. Really, like on a Thursday night, if you pray, like now, if you wanted to pray, it's 10 minutes. You say Baruch Hu, Shema, Ve'ahavta, and you do a silent Amidah prayer, and it takes maybe 15 minutes if you're a zealot, right? If you're like extra, it takes 15 minutes. And Friday night prayer is on Shabbat evening, and Friday is even shorter because the Amidah prayer for Saturday is actually shorter than the weekday Amidah. Because in the weekday Amidah, you have 18 blessings, which became 19 blessings, but never mind. And then on Shabbat, God also needs to rest. So you're not going to ask all those things from God. You just basically thank God for Shabbat, and that's it. So there's only 7 blessings. So it's really short. The Shabbat evening prayer could have been 15, 20 minutes. The Kabbalists who sit in Tzfat, remember, they left all sorts of places and they came to the mountaintops of the Galilee where I used to live until 2 years ago. And they're living in the land of Israel and they're all excited about this amazing cosmic drama in which they partake. And for them, the drama of transitioning from the 6 days of creation into the holy day of Sabbath is just too dramatic. 15 minutes of prayer can't do it. They have to invent a longer prayer, a longer ritual. Because the 6 days of creation are portrayed as the masculine part of the divine, and the Sabbath as the feminine part of the divine. And because every week the marriage between the masculine and the feminine happens in their hearts and happens in the universe. And they're part of this great drama of repairing the world and bringing redemption to themselves, to the Jewish people, to humanity, to the universe. And all this thing is happening every Friday night. And then what? You're just going to go to synagogue for 15 minutes? Doesn't work. So you need to have a larger ritual, a more extensive one. And so what they do is that they basically cut and paste the model of the Jewish shacharit, the prayer shacharit, in which before you get to the main part of the prayer, which is Baruch Hu and Amidah, Shema, you say some psalms. And what they do is they take, you might guess how many psalms? How many psalms do they take? It's before the Sabbath. How many psalms? If you're a Kabbalist and you have to invent the ritual, how many psalms would you take?
6.
Well, 6 or 7 is exactly what they do. They take 6 psalms and the 7th, which is a psalm to the day of the Sabbath. Okay? Representing the 6 days of creation, which to them also represent powers in the divine whatever that they hold, and then they between the 6 psalms. Well, they start with a poem that one of them writes called Yedid Nefesh. Sometimes we also sing. Then they sing through, or they chant or sing through 6 psalms that they took. And then before they go to the 7th psalm of the day of the Sabbath, another guy from that circle writes a poem called Lecha Dodi, which really is, if you ever look at it, it's if you don't just do verses 1, 2, 5, and 9, which we do, but you actually read the whole thing, is a whole really fascinating progression of how Sabbath comes through the soul of the individual, goes through things such as sadness and despair and feeling broken and shattered, and slowly the soul remembers who she really is. I say she because they address the soul as feminine. And then the soul slowly rises out of the dust and wipes the dust and the sorrow and the tears and wears garments of majestic garments and takes her superpowers and fights her enemies, and here we are and it's Shabbat and everything is amazing, and finds balance and center, and here we are majestic and it's Shabbat. This is the poem the Chadodi, which all the Jews in the world sing. No, there's like 1,000 different melodies, and then they add another Kabbalistic prayer which is said in silent, which is talking about the union of the female, the masculine and the feminine. And at the last stanza of the Chadodi, what do? We rise up and face the door. Doesn't that seem awkward to you? Like, what the heck is that thing? And the reason being is that because the traditionally, Judaism thought of its deity as either nothing at all or as masculine, right? And they say a huge part of Kabbalah, and it's also in the text later on, is that although God itself is like everything and neither and all, if we address God as, it can't be just masculine. There also has to be a feminine, like yin and yang sort of. And basically, since the ark usually represented the masculine God, by turning to the other side and bowing to the other side, they were actually bowing to the Shekhinah, which they understood to be the female aspect of the divine. So they bow to the feminine, and then we turn and we do the barch, we bow to the masculine, and we unite them, which is very radical in the 16th century. Okay, and then if we think about Reform Judaism, as where we actually have, men and women sit together, and men and women can be rabbis, and LGBTQ, etc. is, we think it's really okay, but that wasn't always the case. In a way, Kabbalah started it all because they said, you can't just think in masculine terms. You have to bring the feminine, and they weren't Reform, and they probably weren't LGBTQ, I don't know, but traditionally you think of them as like more traditional people, and you also can't judge them according to modern or postmodern criteria. They're ancient people, right? But the beginning of understanding that you can't just talk about God as king and father and right, and bringing that kind of like multi-gender language into Judaism started in that, and all the Jews until today, they stand, they turn, they face the door, and they have no idea why. But it's Kabbalistic. The whole ritual is Kabbalistic, and then after this Lechadodi thing, they would go and read the 7th Psalm, which is about the Holy Sabbath, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, and only then they would turn to the evening prayer, which is Baruch Hu, Shema, V'ahavta, etc., etc. Right? So the whole thing that we do is actually a Kabbalistic ritual, but we don't know it. We don't know it, which is also interesting. Like, why is our liturgy so heavily influenced by Kabbalah and we don't know it? And there are reasons for that, historical reason for that, but nonetheless it is. And many other rituals in Judaism, or customs, or foods, or things, even the Passover Seder dish that has all those things on it, and you don't know why, it's influenced by Kabbalah. And many other things that you just don't know, but you do it. I do it. People tend to do it. So the influences of a Kabbalah are greater than people realize. Greater than people realize. Great question. Thank you. Any more questions, or shall we read another paragraph? Let's read another paragraph. Who wants to read? Okay.
At its heart, Jewish mysticism is concerned with encountering and understanding the divine. It explores the delicate interplay between God's transcendence and immanence, teaching that the divine presence permeates all existence and can be accessed through contemplative awareness, sacred study, and ethical refinement.
Keep going.
Okay. The central aspiration of the mystic is the veikut,
Veikut, yeah.
a state of intimate cleaving to God. This is pursued through meditation, intentional prayer, moral discipline, and symbolic practices. Kabbalistic spirituality also expands beyond the individual soul, engaging communal, national, and universal practices of redemption, liberation, cocoon, repair, and transformation.
All right. Any thoughts? few of you said the divine right before, so this addresses that a little bit. So what do you make of this?
It's a lot.
I know. Well, we never promised you, this is not like, this is heavy stuff, but in a good way, right?
Yeah.
So what do you, what's a lot?
It incorporates a lot of things. So there's like a variety in how you could practice.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are many ways in which one can practice. And in fact, if God or the divine permeates all of reality, then there's probably countless ways by which that can be experienced. And also different things might work for different people. Right? So if you are more, intellectually inclined, you might do it through text and reading, right? If you're more embodied, you might do it through like more bodily practices. If you more of a lone wolf, you might want to do it alone. If you're more of a communal person, you might want to do it in a group. All right. If you are, in other words, it's not necessarily but one technique. And in fact, there have been many schools of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is not one thing. It's a broad phenomenon that developed over the course of many centuries in many different places, such as Spain, the land of Israel, Europe, the Middle East, Venice. There's actually Kabbalists live in very, very cool places. Like if one day we'll like do where the Zohar was written, we can go like places like Crete and Venice and Spain and the shores of France and Egypt and Israel and Morocco, and in other words, like all around the Mediterranean basin. So it's not one, and there were different Kabbalists and it's also who had different schools of Kabbalah. Some were more ecstatic, some were more prophetic, some were more theosophic. So there's really many ways to go about it. But what is the it, though? What is the purpose of it? What is it?
Oh, it's in the first line. Encountering and understanding the divine.
Yeah. Yeah. What's that?
Spiritual understanding or greater peace and understanding.
Right. So this is so you see, so this is actually in some, so you see, so one might ask, what is Judaism? And actually some of the confusion in the world about Judaism, also amongst Jews, is that there's more than one answer to that. Right? I think that's how your class started, right? Early in the year, is that maybe there was even I who was here, and I would say, what is Judaism? For some people, it's actually like an ethnic group, like it's a DNA. There's Jewish genes, and there's for sure Jewish ethnicity, and right. For some people, so the people who live in Israel, for them, they live in a nation that's Jewish, right? For some people, it's not precisely national or ethnic; it's more cultural, right? For some people, Judaism is folklore. Like my Judaism is, the food that I eat, the songs that right? For some people, Judaism is a religion, like this, like a dogma, right? Or certain prayers that I do. And for some people, Judaism is a spiritual path. And by the way, for many people, it's more and all of the above. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive to one another, right? So some of the confusion is that, some people think, but is it a religion or is it an ethnicity? Is it a spiritual thing or is it and it's confusing. But really, it's not that one of those components is the only one or the truer one. It's a different way to think about it and relate to it. For sure, when you talk about Kabbalah, at the core of it, I would say, is this idea of connecting to the divine. Actually, to the extent that we believe that there is a divine. Maybe some people are atheists, and they can also be wonderful Jews. There are Jews who are atheists, and that's fine too. But and they can study Kabbalah as well as a cultural thing, as an intellectual, whatever, But then that to those of us who say yes, there is some spiritual component to reality, to existence, and that we are interested in having a relationship, a connection to that. How do we attain that? For sure, Kabbalah at the core tries to address that, to give us both practices and a mindset by which to have a direct relationship with the divine in each of every moment of our lives. The book Zohar, what does Zohar mean? Radiance, enlightenment, Right, just like in the Far Eastern religion, people speak about enlightenment as a self-transformation process. That's exactly the same thing that the Zohar means. It's a book that wants to teach people how to understand divine light, radiance in the world, and how to connect with it, and how to allow for it to be a transformative force that changes people's lives. At the core, that is what Kabbalah tries to teach. And it views Judaism as a system that teaches that. Right? So, and then there's different ways to go about it. So some schools of Kabbalah are very, very connected to the Jewish rituals and practices that we know. They would tend to observe Judaism in a very strict way, or less of a strict way, but basically their spiritual practices would be the Jewish practices only with a Kabbalistic intention. See, so I could go to make it, give a simple example, I could go to Temple Sinai and go through a whole prayer and whatever, like, oh, I stand, I sit, but right, or I could say, oh, now I'm integrating the masculine and the feminine, and as part of the cosmic drama of inner peace and harmony, every time I sing the Chadadi and I face to the door and then I face the other way, and it's like, you see what I mean? So a Kabbalist would be more of the latter. And the same would go for Passover and for Yom Kippur, and everything has what we call it kavanah, an inner intention of how I do the practice. If you ever come to Friday night or Saturday morning services, you see that I try to do that a little bit. Like I try to give people, before we say that, what is it that we're saying? Why are we doing this? What is this thing? Take a breath, meditate. This is not per se Kabbalah, but it's, let's say, Kabbalah influenced kavanah, inner intention of what I do, not just in prayer. In Hebrew, kavanah is my kavanat halev, the intention of the heart, and everything that I do. Other Kabbalists were less interested in the Jewish prayers and rituals and holidays. They basically developed other systems of practice that were more meditational. So those Kabbalists would kind of like, that's called more ecstatic Kabbalah or prophetic Kabbalah. They would like lock themselves up in an attic or go to the forest and meditate, like, let's say on the names of God and or breath or things like that. So they were less about going to the synagogue and praying. They were more about doing some as other esoteric practices. And then, why not do both, right? You could, depending on who you are. And so there's more than one way to go about it. But at the core, the same idea is that there is a possibility to, as part of the human experience and part of our experience of this reality, to have the divine presence as something that is very prominent in our life, is transformative to us. And then also that paragraph, that sentence, that it could be in the realm, either in the realm of the individual or in the realm of society or a group or even a nation. Speaking of, for example, Zionism. Right, so maybe it's or the world. And different Kabbalists throughout history had different focuses. Foci? Does it say? What do you say? Foci or focuses?
Focuses.
Focus, it's not like octopus, right? It doesn't work. So I was hoping, but it's not, it didn't work. So some people are more interested about their own processes. I'm not saying it in a judgmental way. Sometimes, especially now in the age, a lot of the age of individualism, right? It's all about me. It really is all about me. My name is Or Zohar. I'm a rabbi. It's all about me, right? I study the Zohar. It's like I'm running in circles, right? So for some, the whole drama is about my own soul, my own liberation, my own connection with the divine, my own transformation, right? But then sometimes, if we're thinking of words such as redemption, revelation, enlightenment, is it just about one person, or is it about the Jews or a group amongst the Jews, like the Kabbalists, or the group, those guys living in Sfat? Is it just about them, or is it about the suffering of the Jewish people and their redemption? And if so, is it that all the Jews are supposed to, the Messiah will come
all the Jews will go to the land of Israel, or is it about the universal redemption of the Jews no matter where they are, in Alaska, in Africa? Or is it actually about humanity? And actually the redemption of all the world, and not even just humanity, all creatures. Right? And if you know anything, for example, about Buddhism, you know that there's different schools in Buddhism that actually address exactly the same questions. What is enlightenment? Is it about the person? Is it about everybody? Right? So similarly in Kabbalah, different Kabbalists and in different times in history had different approaches to those things. It's not a monolithic movement.
I was thinking about Buddhism as you were talking. I was thinking, so what is the big difference?
So once upon a time, I was a bachelor student in Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Great college, by the way, if you ever get a chance to visit. And I actually double majored in Jewish thought and Indian studies. So I studied both Judaism, Kabbalah, and also almost by accident, I got very interested. I started with world religion, and then I was drawn to the Hinduism and Buddhism stuff. So I studied some Sanskrit and classical Tibetan, and I remember nothing of those languages, but at a relatively young age, I had a very intimate encounter with those traditions, and it was very transformative to me. And I remember coming to my Buddhism and classical Tibetan teacher at Hebrew, telling her, like, I was like 21, very excited. Like, listen, there's so many similarities between Kabbalah and Buddhism, yay, like excited. And she looked at me and she said, when you start studying Kabbalah and Buddhism, it seems like they're very much related. And then you go deeper and you realize that they're very different. But then you go even deeper and you realize that they're very much related. And then you go even deeper and you realize that they're, in other words, yes, they're, because there are similarities, because I think that this, the spiritual quest of humanity is universal, because all human beings ask these questions. It's like, why are you surprised that people in India and people in Africa all eat food or sleep? It's a human, but this food has like more like of this, paprika, and this one has curry, and here they eat beef, and here they're vegetarian, but everybody eats. And they say, oh, is it similar? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Right? And then there's like the cultural differences and the climate differences, and right. So yes, in many ways, when you go deeper into, so today I had lunch with some sheikhs from the mosque here, and I actually had breakfast. I had a very interfaithy day. I had breakfast with a reverend and lunch with the Muslim sheikhs. And, in some ways, all these cultures and religions are similar. And also in some ways, we're very different. Actually, we're talking about with the Muslim, it was very interesting, because in some ways, like, they also think of Joseph and David and Moses as prophets. But in some ways, the way that they think of it is very different. For example, I told them in the Jewish Bible, all these people are very flawed. Moses sinned, David was a mess, they all, and it's on purpose, because in Judaism, we stress the fact that even though that's not even Kabbalah, it's just plain Torah, right? That everybody is messed up, so that you don't make any rabbi or king or anyone like it's not above you. Right? We don't believe that there's perfect people, that there's people who are like totally enlightened. And yeah, even our biggest prophets and spiritual teachers and leaders and kings are also flawed human beings on purpose. And in Islam, they're like, no, the prophets, maybe they made mistakes, but they weren't sinful. It's different. It's a different understanding. But then but if you want to go deeper, what is sin? What is a mistake? So I'm just giving this example to say that, yes, there are many similarities between Buddhism and Kabbalah, but there's also differences, because Buddhism is rooted in Buddhism. If you go to here, it's taught as a philosophy, but if you go to Tibet, it's a religion. Mm-hmm. They have temples, they have cult, they have statues, they have holidays. right? So Judaism is a spiritual path, sorry, Kabbalah is a spiritual path that's embedded in Jewish culture, in the Hebrew language, in Hebrew holidays, rituals, concepts, culture. It's not, I wouldn't say that it's better or worse than Buddhism or Hinduism, it's just different. Obviously, when they speak about connection with the divine, and we speak about connection with the divine, like beyond the words, it's probably, there's a lot that's the same, but it's also very different. All right, any more questions?
Yeah, can I ask?
Yeah.
Is there like any contribution from Baharian or like Asian Judaism to Kabbalah or vice versa?
What was the first that you said? Baharian?
Yeah, Baharian or like Asian Judaism in Kabbalah? Because you mentioned there's like contributions from like Europe, Spain.
So I think that, and this is something that I'm also going to get to further in the text, but the influences. So look, Judaism is a sister religion to Christianity and Islam because we are really sister religions that grew up in close proximity and mutual influences throughout history. And you can show direct influences between those three religions, including in the mystical. So you can see, so Sufism, Sufi Islam and Kabbalah Judaism is very Christian mysticism. A lot of the Shekhinah traditions, the feminine divine in Kabbalah, it has close relation to mystical tradition of Virgin Mary, for example. Because why? Because these people were neighbors. They always lived side by side. Whereas, if you look for a connection between like that and Hinduism and Buddhism, that's a little more far-fetched historically, just because it was so geographically different. So here, people have always traveled to the east, and yes, if you live in Iran, right, or in other words, the Jews, people did travel to India also. We didn't invent that, right? Did they understand Hinduism? I don't know, but they were, so, and also there just, again, there's similarities because people think about those things, and even if it was not influenced, but parallel, we as modern people can draw the parallels, and for sure, in the modern age, with all the cultural mix that we have today, of course, that there's, like, I can't think about Kabbalah without my Buddhist influences. I admit it. It's just, I'm a product of the modern era. When I learned Buddhism, I learned Hinduism, I learned Kabbalah, and and since the 60s for sure, and even from before that, in the early 20th century, the 19th century in Europe, people have already been making these connections. So, yes and no. Yeah. Meditation. Okay. Is Jewish prayer meditation the same as meditation? Is it? What is it? You see what I mean? Maybe yes, maybe no. There's more than one way to think about it. Connection to the body. Right? If I do yoga, and then then instead of saying Om, I say Shalom. Is that? See, there's more than one way to think about it. Okay, so yeah, what else? Should we keep reading? Let's keep reading. Where are we? Yeah, go ahead. Anyone who hasn't read yet, who wants to read? Someone who has read, I don't care. Someone read. Major texts and trends.
Foundational works of Jewish mysticism include the Zohar, the core text of classical Kabbalah, offering symbolic, mythic, and esoteric interpretation of Torah. Sefer Yetzirah, an early mystical treatise exploring the creation of the cosmos through Hebrew letters and numbers. Prophetic Kabbalah, developed by Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, emphasizing meditative techniques, letter permutations, and ecstatic union. Lurianic Kabbalah, the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, introducing Tzimtzum,
Shvirat
HaKelim, and Tikkun.
Maybe read one more paragraph.
Classical Kabbalah is grounded in a symbolic map of divine reality known as the Tree of Life, composed of 10 Sephirot, dynamic emanations through which the infinite Ein Sof becomes manifest. These sephirot are often understood in masculine and feminine pairs expressing complementary qualities such as expansion and contraction, giving and receiving, transcendence and immanence. Central to this system is the relationship between Kudsha Brihu, the masculine aspect of the Holy One, blessed be He, and the Shekhinah, the feminine, indwelling divine presence, whose harmonious union symbolizes cosmic balance and spiritual wholeness. Lurianic Kabbalah deepened this symbolic framework with a mythic account of creation. The Tzimtzum, a divine self-contraction, making space for the world, the dramatic Shvirat HaKelim, shattering of the vessels, and the ongoing process of Tikkun, human and cosmic work of gathering scattered sparks and repairing the fractured world.
Well, thank you for reading all that. It's a very, very condensed text. Questions?
Break it down a little bit.
Yeah, so about the books, the major, maybe the most central book of Kabbalah is no doubt the Zohar, the one that I've been passing around here. So this yellow book that is in English, that's just volume 1 out of, I don't know, like maybe 15, just to give you the scope of the Zohar. Okay, so it's a very long, right? So so that's a 13th century, more or less. Although I said some parts of it are more ancient, and some parts of it are a bit newer. 13th century Spain, simply saying, explosion of Kabbalistic theory, knowledge, metaphor, symbolism. A lot of the things that happened before the Zohar were kind of like quiet, and not that there wasn't Kabbalah before, but it wasn't so explicitly and rigidly written. And the Zohar is, and then also the influence of the Zohar after it's been written is immense. And everything else is relates to it. So if you want to start somewhere, maybe I'd start with the Zohar. And traditionally, the Zohar is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a 2nd century rabbi who lived in the land of Israel, because the Zohar itself has a frame story that has been written by the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his students who lived in the land of Israel. Therefore, the Lurianic Kabbalites fought. They went back to the Galilee because they wanted to relive the story in their own selves. And if you ask like an ultra-Orthodox, kind of like naive, maybe not naive person, who wrote the Zohar and how old it is, they say, oh, it's 2,000 years old. It was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai 2,000 years ago. However, we have no quotation of this book until the 13th century. No one speaks of it, and from the 13th century, you hear a lot about it, and also the language and the ideas. And in other words, the research knows that it's much later, but because it's called pseudo-epigraphy. Kabbalists are sitting in Spain and in other places in the 13th century, 14th century, 12th century, and they see themselves spiritually as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his students who lived in the land of Israel many, many years before them. And maybe because they were modest, maybe because they didn't, for political reasons, they didn't want to write the thing that they were writing as if they wrote it. They were cautious or modest, humble, and they wrote it as if somebody, or to give their teachings more credibility. There could be more than one reason why they did it. So we actually don't know who wrote the Zohar. Until today, we don't know. And for 150 years, there's academic debate as to who wrote the Zohar. And there's other Kabbalistic books of the time that we know who wrote them, but they weren't as influential as the Zohar. Not even half as much. And the Zohar becomes very influential, and we don't know who wrote it because they attributed it to those ancient rabbis. Interesting. We do know that it was not written by one person. Like I said, it was actually written by groups of different Kabbalists who copied manuscripts from one another and then added their own ideas. So there's thousands of different manuscripts with different versions of the book. It's very complicated. And what it is essentially is a mystical commentary on Torah. It starts from Genesis, but it looks at Torah not as, just a simple text, but as actually the word of God, which means that it has many, many deep meanings. So when you read it, and because Hebrew is a holy language, you actually can read it completely different than what it actually says. And it goes deep, and that's basically what the Zohar is. And it talks about the Sefirot. Did you read about the Sefirot? You did?
Yes.
Right, so one basic concept in Kabbalah that you should know about is this. Okay, is this diagram, which has existed before the Zohar actually, but it existed before the Zohar, but becomes very explicit in the Zohar. Basically, these 10 circles describe 10 different emanations of the divine. So even though everybody knows that God is one and God is infinite, the Kabbalists believe that in our limited human mind and awareness, we can perceive different aspects of the divine as being separate from one another. In reality, they're not separate from one another on the divine end. Because our consciousness is limited, if we want to get to know the divine, we have to actually understand that it can be perceived in more than one way, right? So some critics of Kabbalah, by the way, say, what is this? This is not monotheism, right? It's almost like Hinduism in the sense that but if you learn Hinduism in its deepness, you know that even though they have many gods, it's actually one. But every god in the Hindu religion is a different aspect that corresponds to others. But then there's also a level where they're all in unity. But so basically, the same thing with Kabbalah. The Kabbalists know that the divine is one and inseparable. But in our consciousness, as we contemplate the divine, we see the world as fragmented. So, for example, masculine and feminine, right, are forces that we perceive as two, complementary forces, right? So they would sometimes address the divine as masculine and sometimes as feminine, but really what they'd work on is the unity of the two. Okay? Or chesed and din, which is mercy and compassion, and then power and judgment. Right? So the more merciful, loving aspects of the divine, and the place where the divine is perceived as more, firm or punishing or challenging. Again, these opposites. In the end, you want to unite them or balance between them. Okay? Or elements of the divine that are more abstract or like spiritual or more physical. Because in Kabbalah, everything is a divine. Even the physical world is part of God. Right? So all these opposites, and this is kind of like more, without getting into too much, we don't have time takes years to actually understand this, but that this system is also this is how we used to depict it, but actually it's not static. These circles are all moving, and the channels between them, think about this more as an animation than a diagram. It's really more dynamic and flowing. It's more about moving the energy between those rather than this is it. And in some other depictions, the Sefirot are arranged differently, like in concentric circles or in different kinds of ways, and these colors are kind of random. By the way, there are Kabbalistic books where they teach so how to connect with those. So they teach like that each one of them does have a color, and you meditate on the color or on a certain sound or on a certain image in order to meditate upon it. But then, of course, in the end, you transcend beyond it. It's not about, these are all symbols that help you meditate. It's not that God is blue or red or orange. It's just ways to get to that experience. Yeah, what a question.
In the reading that he did, it said that some of these are like masculine and feminine. Is it specifically like some words are
Yes and no, because in the deep element, each one of those is both masculine and feminine,
Okay.
depending to the relationship that it has with another one.
Mhm.
So for example, and everything actually is both. Traditionally, the Shekhinah, which is the lowest one, is
Mhm.
thought of as feminine.
Okay.
The left side is thought more of as feminine, the right side more as masculine.
Okay.
But actually, this is an oversimplification, because in the depth of it, all these, so usually, let's say if one is more inner and one is around it, that the one inner would be thought of as masculine, to the one that's surrounded, just because of the physicality of like
Mhm.
intercourse.
Yeah.
Right? But it doesn't mean that that same thing that is masculine can't be feminine, or something that's inside that.
Right.
Right,
you
so
said
it's-
they're, like,
So it's a little more,
cultural-
so people sometimes tend to oversimplify those things.
Right, it's not a static.
You see,
thing,
so
like
it's
you said.
exactly, it's
Yeah.
not, it's actually much more fluid, and in fact, in modern, I would say postmodern times, many people who are talking about, like gender, queer, Judaism, they actually they relate to Kabbalah a lot because of this actually fluidity of gender. And it's, again, the people who in the Middle Ages who invented those things, I don't think that they were as fluid as maybe some postmodern people are. Maybe they were. Culturally, we think of them as more traditional people, but in their spiritual experiences and the way that they describe it, you can see a lot of things that could serve as a basis for more postmodern interpretations that we can rely upon. And it's very interesting. There's a lot of literature. Michael Jonathan Boyarin, I think, is one, for example, who wrote about that. But there's many others. Yeah. Yeah. So nowadays you'd have people you'd have like modern queer readings of Kabbalah, and it's always a question how much of it is really in the original text and how much of it is modern interpretations, and some way it also doesn't matter.
Right,
But
a lot of Judaism is the modern interpretation of like old writings anyway, like
Yeah.
what we make of it is what it is.
yes,
for us.
so and then also like there is validity to like academic research of trying. It is, I think it does, like the historical context, and for sure, as someone who's read parts of the Zohar and parts of Kabbalah, of course, there's a lot of gender talk about the divine and about the human experience and the soul. And it is very fluid and very interesting and very radical in some ways, also depending which Kabbalists and which, some were more, some were less. Some were very implicitly chauvinist, some were less. It really depends on but for sure, it opens the door to a gender fluid experience of the divine, of the human soul, of the nature of reality, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Mhm. That fluidity, by the way, is not just about gender. It's also about, for example, Jewish versus other religions, or Jewish identity versus other identities, or Jewish versus human, right? Because again, once you start talking about the divine, is God Jewish? If we're talking about a connection to the divine that is, basically you can describe it with words, but by the way, a lot of Kabbalistic texts or ritual, it's clear that so maybe all we have left is a text that someone wrote, but it's clear that because we don't have recordings and we don't see how they prayed and how they sang and how they danced and how they fasted and how they ate and how they went in the forest and jumped around, we only have a text, right? And it's very clear that those texts direct you beyond language to an experience. So, right? So if God isn't a word, and in fact, God is an English translation. In Kabbalah, there's 70 different names of God. Which one is God? It's none of those. That's an English term. Okay? It's also heavily coded by Christian and other threads. So to learn about the divine, which is also a word, right? In the end, there's only so much that the words can describe. So when we talk about experiences that are beyond words, beyond culture, beyond our own identity even, just like you can't say that God is a man or a woman, you can't say that God is Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist. See what I mean? So there is a whole field that language and identity and organized religion can only take you so much. But if you go deeper, of course, then you meet in a field that is deeper and beyond language, transcends language or identity. So hence, also I think I don't know how much time we have. Are we out of time? Also to say that that's also why, you could take this home and read it. That's also why, and really this is more than we can in an hour and a half, and that's okay, an hour and 50 minutes, is that there is a radical component to Kabbalah. There's some aspects of Kabbalah are very traditional, and sometimes you have Kabbalists who are extremely traditional and observant, but only because actually Kabbalah has a very radical element to it, because it deconstructs and reconstructs reality, language, religion, tradition. It actually, in some ways, has undermined the rabbinic authority of the Jewish law. Because again, if we understand that according to Kabbalistic interpretations, the religious experience of the individual and their connection to the divine is real, can anyone prophesize? And why is the authority of the rabbis and their laws, why are they like, I can change it? And in fact, people have changed it according to Kabbalah, which is also why, whereas most of the rabbis studied Kabbalah, there are also ones who didn't. To be fair, there are also ones who objected it and said that it's stupid and horrible. But for the most part, actually, rabbis did study it, but they kept it to themselves. Especially after all sorts of things happened in Jewish history that made people like the religious establishment afraid of Kabbalah, because they saw that it has radical elements that were undermining the Orthodox religious authority, and kind of banned it and said, if you want to study it, you have to be at least 40 years old. If you want to study it, you have to be a married male. If you want to study it, you have to lead an Orthodox life. If you want to study it, giving it all sorts of restrictions, which basically only made people want to study it more. Because if you say to someone, don't open that box, you're not allowed, what you're going to want to do? Don't push the red button, don't press the red button. You're going to want to press the red button, right? So there is something, and we need to finish. There is something about the word Zohar means radiance, but it also means caution. Zehirut in modern Hebrew is so I say, yes, read it. Yes, it does teach about the radiance in God and the divine and all those things, but handle with care. It's really because it's radical, because it kind of like there's a kind of like a radical element to it. You can study those things, but handle it with care, really with respect, with patience, with understanding that when you go deep, you can really meet yourself on the psychological levels, on the kind of things that erase or question our identity and who we are, and if you really take it seriously. And therefore, yes, learn it, but handle with care, and also respectful. Speaking of Madonna and everything else, that in the end, speaking of cultural appropriation, and in other words, Kabbalah, I'll steal 5 minutes from your time and I'll let you go. Kabbalah is something that every human being can benefit from. Just like I can study yoga, which comes from Hinduism, or Buddhist meditation, that comes from Buddhism, but I also have to be respectful that, when I study yoga, it comes from Hinduism. And when I study Buddhism, that it comes from a certain, in other words, I say when we study Kabbalah, we also want to be respectful that it's a Jewish thing and that it's best understood in Jewish context. It doesn't mean that other people can't study it. Right? But if I'm going to go and adopt some Native American ritual, maybe I can do it in a respectful way that they will also endorse, but also have to be respectful that it comes from that tradition. So I will say that's, and yes, Kabbalah has infiltrated, pop culture, but also and if we are living in a Jewish community, and if we know Hebrew, and if we observe Jewish rituals, that is the Sabbath and the Jewish holidays, and if we read the Torah, it's a very good, fertile and healthy ground to which to add Kabbalah. Kind of gives it context. Whereas if you study it without all those, it can be a little bit far-fetched and weird. Not saying that you can't do it, but you understand that it goes together. It's kind of more of a respectful, balanced kind of way. More than we can achieve, and we didn't talk about all these other things, and if you have more questions, you can ask me. If you want to study more, you're in luck because I teach a Kabbalah class here every Wednesday night. It's called Journeys of the Soul. You can also connect online. We had one session, but there's 5 more, and we talk about the question of the soul in Kabbalah. And you can join from this Wednesday, you can still join, and again, even 5 sessions is not a lot. Same time, 7:15 to 8:30. And in a few weeks after that, I'll be teaching another course when this course is already going to be over. So if you're too busy to come, there'll be many, God willing, many opportunities to study more Kabbalah at Temple Sinai. And there's I gave you here a bibliography so you can read more and explore more on your own. In other words, this is just a taste. I hope it was useful to you. Thank you for asking questions, for coming, and God bless you. What's that? Yes, please enroll through the website of the congregation, but you can just go to the website and tap the link to Rosh Esther. Rosh Esther. See it on the website. You can just join. Rosh Esther is our Wednesday night track. It has different classes, and you can connect on Zoom and learn. Yeah, sure. And if you have more questions about this, you can also always meet me in person. Talk to you. Sure, you're welcome. Sure. Absolutely, my pleasure.
I learned how to shut off the computer too today.
There you go.
Shut it off and learn.
Good. I'm really hopeful that this, when I was late this Sunday morning.
We're ready. Marcia and I are so ready.
Sometime, and Josh is also going to learn. So basically, it doesn't have to depend on me that the tech has nothing to do with me. Or if the person comes with a thumbnail drive, et cetera, et cetera.
So Marcia and I were very excited about this today.
Good night, Frank. Take care.
But I will tell you though, there isn't